Hello there. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the common myth of preservation of the Quran. Now, many people have heard, either at Speaker's Corner or elsewhere, or just perhaps from local Muslim preachers, Muslim da'is, Muslim imams, that the Quran has been perfectly preserved letter for letter, word for word, dot for dot. There has only ever been one Quran. It's never changed. It's never been anything different. It's always been exactly the same right up to the time of the Prophet. Now, Western academia knows that's not true, and Islamic scholars know that's not true, and anyone who's done a cursory introductory overview of this topic knows it's not true. And yet it's still something we hear quite often. And I think sometimes it's good just to find examples of academics who are openly saying that this isn't true whatsoever. And I think it's just a good way to sort of put the nail in the coffin. The only viable understanding of the Quran is not that it's been perfectly preserved, but rather that it has been under a process of many different variations, many different readings, where there has been an attempt at arguing that they themselves go back to the Prophet, who recited them in many different ways. And there are a ton of questions about this. There's also been a standardization process from Uthman, who collected copies of the Quran from many different places. Keep in mind, he didn't do it from those who had memorized it alone. He did it from a written text as well. He also then made a decision to standardize it according to the dialect of the Quraysh. He then burnt the remaining ones. And one of the things that Western scholars, and I guess Islamic scholars, have been trying to answer is exactly what were those things that he burnt. We still don't know to this day. But let's have a look at what some scholars say about this. And I think it's quite revealing and quite important to go through this kind of stuff. So let's start off with this conversation with a Western academic who specializes in the transmission of the Arabic from its earliest times of the Quran. He is Dr. Hyman Sidki. He is here having a conversation with Paul Williams from Speaker's Corner. So let's see what he says regarding the idea of preservation.
Many people, maybe most, I don't know, many Muslims grow up not knowing anything outside of the Hafs tradition. And they don't get exposed to the idea that there are other reading traditions and that there are Quranic variants and that all sort of this whole system framework that I discussed. And it might be surprising to some people, but and unfortunately, actually, so I have heard some preachers that do say that there's only, one reading or one Quran or something like that. And if I were to be very generous, I would say that falls under the umbrella of like lies to children, if that makes sense. So lies to children. So I'll give you an example. It's actually a thing. You can go look this up on Wikipedia.
I'll have to Google it afterwards.
Yeah, but just I'll give you an example. So for example, in physics, when you first start learning about things, you learn that the world is Newtonian, right? Things are continuous. But then you grow up a little bit and you learn like, well, that's actually not true. The world is quantized. We live in a quantum world. But then if someone got exposed to quantum mechanics, would they feel cheated and lied to that, you taught me that things were classical, but in reality, things were quantized. I know this is a very nerdy example, but I think the same thing applies here in that sometimes people do go give a very simple explanation like, hey, look, this is the Quran, this is the one, this is it. When in reality, things are more complex. But within the tradition itself, at a scholarly level, these things are very well, it's not a secret. It's extremely
well known, well documented forever.
Right. So just to jump in here. So he categorizes this, and this is his words that you just heard, like lies to children. When you talk about the idea that there is just one reading of the Quran, there is just one way that the Quran is, one mode, and it's always been that way. He calls it the equivalent, and he says he's choosing his words carefully, and he's being generous even. This is like saying lies to children. See, if I was a Muslim, I would be very worried about that, because that to me is probably the most patronizing thing that you could be told, that the very understanding you have theologically about your religion, your own scripture, is equivalent to someone telling lies to their own children. And I think that's really, you can tell that Paul's obviously taken back by what he's just said. He even asked him to repeat it. And then the Dr. Hyman Sidki says, well, this is well known. This isn't a secret. Like in academia, both in Western scholarship and in Islamic scholarship, this is well known. No one questions this. And so you have this weird situation where there are so many people, so many Muslims who have grown up their whole life thinking there is only one Quran, when there is no academic basis for this whatsoever. There is no historical basis for this whatsoever. In fact, every instance of Islamic history is incredibly open. The earliest that we have, very open about the fact that no, there are multiple readings. There are people who affirm multiple readings. You can look at the history of Ibn Mujahid and you look at how he canonized some of these readings. And again, it's an interesting point because this is not what Muslims are told. They are told a complete fabricated lie as a theological polemic or apologetic that is used either to attack Christianity or to affirm how Islam differs from Christianity and is somehow better. And this, of course, what Dr. Hyman Sikhi has said is right at the heart of this. And Paul, I think, has realized this. And let's see what he says. Let's see what he says now.
But there's a problem, and this is very, very interesting what you're saying. There's a problem here. You mentioned globalization, the standardization of knowledge, and perhaps, frankly, or you were too polite to say it, the lack of education on behalf of some Muslims in not knowing about these facts. But the problem is this, is that there are certain well-known polemicists, Christian polemicists, again, I won't mention their name, who have taken advantage, shall we say, of this lack of awareness to denigrate and attack the integrity of the Quran and Islam. So they might say, well, you Muslims claim that every tiny little word and character and letter in the Quran is absolutely identical and it's uniform and one going right back to the beginning. But actually, we know that, as you were saying, there are these recognized variants that have been openly discussed and known about forever. But this is used as a way of discrediting and attacking the Quran. And some Muslim apologists who are not perhaps aware of the scholarship, Islamic scholarship from the ulama going back many, many centuries, have unwittingly played into this missionary attack on the Quran. But it seems like the whole thing needn't be a problem if we could just understand, to use your nerdy analogy, the difference between Newtonian mechanics and Einstein's quantum mechanics, if that was quite what you said. But it is becoming a problem, though, in the relationship between these two religions, Christianity and Islam, and the polemics that go on there, because it is being exploited by certain people. And some Muslims seem to be feeding into this because of their lack of awareness of Islamic scholarship. Is that obviously you might not want to comment on missionary polemics, but there does seem to be happening in our world nevertheless.
So again, it deviates straight to this point. This is bad for Islam. This is bad for the Ummah, because we've been telling people for decades now that the Quran has been perfectly preserved, letter for letter, word for word, dot for dot. We're now being called out on this, and it's something we've known was a lie forever. But now we don't have a defense, and now we're being caught out, and now people are holding us account. Even the own Ummah is saying, wait, this isn't true anymore. You've lied to me. How do we solve this? This is a problem because Christians are exposing us. That's in effect what he's saying, but he's saying it as gently as he possibly can. And it's such a weird question to ask an academic as well. It's kind of like, right, so you've said that saying that there is only ever one Quran is equivalent to telling lies to children. This is a problem because we've been telling them this for decades now as a polemic against Christianity, as an apologetic for Islam. How do we backtrack from this? What is he supposed to say? In fact, he goes on to sort of gently be like, well, I can't really talk about that. It's not my fault that not my fault that Muslims have been saying this, that sheikhs and imams have been saying this for decades now. And it's finally coming back to roost. And it's like, well, yeah, that's what you get when you tell lies about your own religion. Now, the next video I wanted to come up with is one that, if it just stops sharing my screen, this is another academic who speaks about this very idea of preservation and how nonsense the idea is. And I want to share this with you because this is also important. Let's hear what this is. Dr. Shadi Nasser from Harvard University in America. He is an expert on Quranic studies and as well as the Arabic language. And he's about to give a summary that contradicts what happens in this video. Effectively, these three guys, actually, it's not three, it's just two. These two guys, Mansour and Farid Responds, give a very weak defense of the fact that there are obviously different readings of the Quran that were being used. And they say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. Trust me, it was revealed in 7 ways. Don't worry about it. And then Dr. Shadi Nasser is added to the end of this clip to explain his view on it. And I want to share that with you now.
this idea that the Quran is preserved word for word, or haraka for haraka, you don't find this kind of opinion in the classical sources. And people will always tell you, well, the Quran is preserved, and inna nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun. It means it is protected. Well, sure, but let us go to these sources and tell us, what does it mean, preservation? So you go to go to any book of exegesis, go to Zamakhshari, go to Tabari, go to Qurtubi, go to any of those tafsir, and then they will never tell you that this verse means that the Quran is preserved word for word, or haraka bar haraka, or harf bar harf. They never say that. All they say, well, the Quran is preserved from omission and additions. It's preserved from the devils or the shayateen to add something to it. It's preserved that the shayateen would never take anything from it, right? So this whole notion that it is protected, word by word, it's something that is used, for the masses in a sense. And it's not based on any academic research, not necessarily Western academic. I'm just talking about even academic research by classical Muslim scholars, because they already knew that when you talk about the Quran being preserved word by word, or haraka by haraka, or etc., that we do have many problems and inconsistencies in the tradition regarding those variant readings.
Well, there you go. Quite simply put, that is not something that has any foothold in academia. There is no academic, either in the Western world or the Islamic world, that says, the Quran has been preserved letter for letter, word by word, dot by dot. It's just a theological lie that is told to Muslims to get them to believe something that no one believes is true. And it's amazing, really. Like, if you really think about the scope of what's happening here, there are entire communities of Muslims who have grown up their entire life believing that there is a perfectly preserved singular Quran in Arabic that has never changed at all in any way whatsoever. And yet their own narrations from their own earliest historians, who were Muslims, who were very highly regarded scholars of Islam and of history of Islam, say, no, that's not true at all. They never had that view. The early Sahaba, the Tabi'un, and so on and so forth, never had this view that there was some sort of word for word, letter for letter, dot for dot. And the reason they didn't have it is because they were fully aware there were different codexes in use. You had Abdullah ibn Masud, you had Ubay ibn Ka'b. They all had their own codex, and they all had different surahs, and they all had different contents. I mean, you cannot say there was consensus when your own histories tell us there was not consensus. It's a lie. It's just an outright fabrication that's used to make people feel good. It's just like a lovely heartwarming thing that you tell children to make them feel better, and that's really sad. And I really hope that if there are any Muslims watching, you understand the scale of this. You've been lied to in the modern world about what people back then thought about the Quran, the greatest scholars, what they thought about the Quran. I wouldn't want to be a part of a religion that did that. Now, one more thing before I end this video is I want to quickly go into an interesting aspect of the Arabic language. And one of the reasons why there was this contention between the different codexes is because the composite rasm, the very bare Arabic skeleton text, did not have the diacritical marks to differentiate certain words, certain vowels, and pronunciation as well. Now, that's a big issue, and I wanted to show two different videos from two different sources, one Muslim, one Christian, so you could get an understanding here that this isn't coming sort of out of field. This is a very well-known basic fact of Arabic. So let's have a look at that. So I'm going to show... I'm going to show the Muslim source first. And then we can go to the Christian one afterwards. So let's have a look at what this Muslim source says. This is from One Path, I think they're called. Here we go.
Exactly the same as the Quran we read today, with only one pretty big difference. It didn't include any skeletal or diacritical marks, which are essential in differentiating different words which otherwise look exactly the same.
Right. Real quickly there, he just said the earliest manuscripts it was just a consonantal rasm, a skeleton text that didn't include diacritical marks. And he said that that was essential for knowing what the word was. Okay, let's continue.
For example, this is the word for elephant, fil, and this is the verb to kiss something, qabbal. However, when you remove the markings, they both look exactly the same. This was how the Mus'haf was written. Now, while
Okay, I think that was great just to demonstrate the point that you can actually create totally different words depending on where these marks go, right? Because there are certain letters in Arabic that do not have enough difference in how they are in terms of hieroglyphics to differentiate them alone, right? You need the actual dots to make the specific letters in Arabic. So let's continue.
whilst these diacritical marks weren't invented until 30 years after the death of Uthman, these markings, what are called skeletal dots, were known to the Arabs at the time of Uthman. But he must have intentionally decided not to include them in his original Mus'haf. Now, whilst we don't really know why, one possible reason is that he wanted to ensure that the Quran would always be taught and preserved through both written and oral methods. And that's where those official reciters who were sent out with copies of the Mus'haf came into play. Without these
So just to quickly add here, he's saying that, okay, so the consonantal dots, they've been around for a lot longer than before Muhammad, so they could have used them if they wanted to. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but we do know that there were some examples of these dots appearing in some of the earliest manuscripts. The issue that we have is they're just not widely used. In other words, most manuscripts don't have these dots in most places. So it doesn't really matter if you see it occasionally. The point is that for the majority of the words that are written on the page, you're not going to be able to distinguish between them unless you happen to have been the original author who would have known what the intent was when he wrote it. But anyone who didn't know the author will not know what the original intent of the word was.
official teachers guiding them, students who studied the Quran wouldn't actually be able to read the text. But with both the written text and an official reciter, the Quran was now completely standardized and able to be transmitted across the Muslim world.
Okay, so this kind of goes with what I'm saying, that you won't know what it actually says unless you have someone who can tell you what it said. And this is why you have the understanding in the deen that you have the people who had these particular readings and they had narrations of those readings that in turn would keep a sort of oral tradition of that reading. The problem with it, though, is that these aren't standardized, which is odd because he says that it is. Well, I mean, it's standardized in the sense that Ibn Mujahid made it so that there were 7 canonical readings, and this is what we call the Qira'at. But again, why 7? Like, there's no reason to think that. No scholar believes that it's related to the Ahruf, which, according to Islamic hadith, there is supposedly 7 different ways or modes or letters in which the Quran was revealed. But we know the Qira'at is not related to that. This comes a lot longer, like much after Muhammad's death. The issue that we have is that these different ways of reciting do actually change the words. And this is something that we keep pointing out at Speaker's Corner, but people just don't want to listen. You can say, look, I can show you, you can even show contradicting narrations, right? You can show contradicting readings of that same Arabic text, depending on where you put these consonantal dots. There are some that completely abrogate, like others, though, contradict others. They'll say things like something did happen, and then a different reading will say something didn't happen. There are ones where it says you are to do something for one person, or in another reading, it'll say for multiple persons. Obviously, those can't be true. They contradict. So which one is it? Now, I don't think theologically that's too sort of groundbreaking, really. I don't think it changes too much. The reason why it's theologically significant is because Muslims still have this idea that it's been perfectly preserved. No one believes this. No one who's ever looked into this still holds this view, or has ever held this view, actually. It's just something that very popular people in Islam have made up and have propagated. And we know this at Speaker's Corner. We can call people out by name who have said things like that. We know Muhammad Hijab has said things like that. We know Mansour has said things like that. We've all seen it and caught it on tape. But unfortunately, it's a big lie. This goes on. This video goes on to basically explain, yep, this is totally fine because they're all saying the same thing. That's not true. That's a lie. They don't say the same thing. And I could do a video showing you the differences. Now, the only last video I want to show real quick is a video where we basically go through the same thing. It comes from a Christian source, but I think it's sufficient to demonstrate a little bit more detail about exactly how the Arabic language works when you start to remove the consonantal dots. Okay, so here we go. Let's have a look at what Jay Smith and Bernie Power say about this.
We have the problem with the Arabic alphabet. You can see here the dots that are there on 22 out of the 28 letters have got, 22 out of the 28 letters can't be distinguished without the dots, otherwise they're the same. If we look at that top line there, you can see it's got an A, it's got three little kind of shapes, and then three little hooks. Without the dots, that just looks like there's 3 letters, but there's actually 7 letters there. The same with all of the others. You have only 7 unambiguous letters amongst the 28 letters there. And so you can have one word without the dots that's called the rasm, or the basic skeleton, and then when you put the dots in, then you'll come up with multiple meanings. You can put dots above or below 1, 2, or 3, depending on the letter, and you get variant readings. So you get down. Sorry, I'll just skip that one. Go to this one. Yeah, okay. Variant readings. So you can see in the bottom of the left-hand column, the word she built is bannat, and the word for she destroyed is tabbat. Without the dots, you can't tell whether she destroyed the city or she built the city. It's completely ambiguous. And you can see a whole lot of others there.
Right, so just to summarize this, depending on where you put the dots, it can create entirely different meanings, some of which actually contradicts, like Bernie Power actually says in the video. You can either build something or destroy something, and the rasm might be the same, the continental rasm, but where you put the actual dots determines exactly what that word says. And that's pretty important. And that is why we know there are arguments among the early readers of the Quran who had their own different readings, Abdullah ibn Masud, Nubay ibn Ka'b, because they thought it was different. And those students who came after him agreed that that is the correct reading in comparison to the Uthmanic Codex. They disagreed with them. And they disagreed because they thought that the rasm should be read in one way, another thought the rasm should be read in another way. And that shows you that in any kind of definition you use, the Quran has not been perfectly preserved. It's just a lie. And that's the real sad part of it. Come to Jesus, because in Christianity, we don't have this concept. We don't try and go around saying that the Bible landed from the sky and it's been the same ever since. That's not what Christians say. That's not part of our theology. We don't make lies about scripture to try and justify why people should come to our faith, but rather we're honest about it. We're honest about academia. We work closely with academia. The amount of times I've seen people like Bart Ehrman and a Christian, from whether it's David Ward or whether it's others, who just have this conversation openly because they're not afraid of it. You could see in the earlier video, there was just this tension between what Paul Williams was saying and what Dr. Haitham Sidki was saying, because he knows he's on shaky grounds and he has to kind of say, well, you know, we've kind of been lying to Muslims for a long time about this now. How do we backtrack? Don't let yourself be lied to, and don't be held captive by a religion that thinks it's okay to lie to you to make you feel better. Always embrace truth, and that truth is Lord Jesus Christ. So I hope you come to him. Have a great day. Take care.